Welcome to r/NuclearRevenge. Here's another story of vengeance out of control. What's his most prized possession? I will destroy it. Kind of a long one, but on the plus side, the only story I'm likely to ever post here. This happened back in 1989. The story involves my stepdad, biological dad, Donald Duck, and my sister, Sis. The person who exacted the revenge has passed now, so it should be safe to relate. I hope it meets the requirement for nuclear revenge. It is a revenge that would warrant prison time, I believe. I was living outside the country when this happened, so my sister relayed all of this information to me about a year after it happened. We recently got together again and went over the events again. My biological parents married when they were very young, and Donald Duck was still in law school. The marriage lasted long enough to produce 2 children. They didn't waste time in those days. My sister, who is 14 months my elder, and myself. They were divorced before I was born. Donald was a serial cheater, a pathological liar, and a total a-hole. He still is. At least a liar and a-hole. He's in his mid-70s now, so maybe not so much with the cheating. The fact that he is still working as a lawyer, I think, is indicative that he was never a good one, as he evidently doesn't have enough to retire. I've looked up reviews on him online, and it's funny to see that most reviewers say that he is not only a terrible lawyer, but a horrible person. When Sis was 22, she was a single mother, and my nephew, her son, was around 3. Her company transferred her to another state. She discovered that Donald Duck lived in a town near her new work location, and thought that he might be able to help her get her bearings in a new place. For a short time, when we were teenagers, he has some sporadic involvement in our lives. After moving to a neighboring city, it was mostly him trying to impress us with how cool and rich he thought we should think he was. So, though it had been a few years since she had seen him, it's not like they were complete strangers. In any case, Donald Duck agreed to let Sis move into his apartment with him, his girlfriend at that time, of course many years his junior, and her 9-month-old child, not Donald's, until she was able to find her own place. He also offered to allow her to keep her belongings in his storage unit. Sis took him up on his offer. Never did Donald Duck make any reference to being paid for the use of the storage unit or paying for utilities at the apartment. Sis stayed 3 months and did her best to get out as quickly as she could, and as far as she could once she became more familiar with the area. Living with him was hard. Did I mention he is an a-hole? And her young son would find his pregnant lady porno mags around the apartment. This is obviously pre-internet. Mr. Duck's young girlfriend was able to help with babysitting, something Sis paid her for. So, Sis gets her own apartment. But all of her things, her son's toys and furniture, household items, everything but her own bed was still in the storage unit. So, she called him to figure out how she could get her things back, but he seemed to want to hang on to them for some reason. He said, "You owe girlfriend money for babysitting, and you can't get your things back until you pay her." She said, "Have you talked to her?" "I have paid her everything I owed her." He puts down the phone and talks to girlfriend, and she confirms that she has been paid. He then says, "Well, you owe 1/3 of the utilities for the time you were here." She reminded him that he had never said anything about that. He gets a little heated, and she's feeling desperate and angry, and shouts an accusation of something he did to her when she was very young, a totally different story. He responds, "Have you ever told anyone that?" She says no. He says, "If you ever do, I will wring your freaking neck." And the conversation ends. She had given up and thought she would never see her things again. About 20 minutes later, she gets a call from an acquaintance who had actually gone on 1 or 2 dates with Donald before she met my sister. He tells Sis that Mr. Duck had just called her, asking if Sis had ever told her anything that he might have done to Sis, hinting at the accusation Sis had made. Sis had never told anyone, and the acquaintance told Donald as much. Sis later calls my stepdad, whom we have always considered to be our dad. He is the only father we knew growing up, and he was in the picture since before we were old enough to remember. He married my mom when I was an infant, and my sister a toddler. They were married 40 years until my mom's death. The guy absolutely had a lot of faults. Passed on 2017. and we often felt better when he wasn't around. But he tried, and it's not easy raising someone else's kids. And he was our dad as far as we were concerned. He actually legally adopted us. He had a lot of issues, but he absolutely hated to see someone be taken advantage of because they were in a weaker position. In other words, he hated a bully, and Donald Duck was being a bully. When I was in the first grade, I rode a school bus with middle and high school students. There were a couple of kids who would bully me. When he found out, he confronted the bullies' dads, and it ended. Another time, I was in the third grade and driving somewhere with him in his pickup around town, and he saw two young teenagers destroying a bicycle that he assumed they had stolen. He stopped and confronted them with his big framing hammer, a Vaughan 16-ounce. I have one like it in his honor. Years later, he broke my mom out of a mental institution by threatening the director or some doctor. I'm not sure. I was young. With that same hammer. Yes, we were a fun family. Anyway, when sis calls him, explaining that Donald Duck is holding all of her possessions hostage, and she doesn't know what to do, he tells her that he knows several Crips who would be happy to rough him up and wouldn't even want to be paid. They would do it for pleasure. Dad was very bothered that Donald was keeping his grandson's things from him and wanted to hurt Mr. Duck. Sis declines this offer. He then asks her, what is the thing that he values most in this world? She responds, his car. His car at that point was a Porsche he had purchased new just a few years before. It wasn't quite the absolute entry-level model, but pretty close. Of course, he had all kinds of arguments about why it was actually better than the more expensive ones. Obviously, it was red. Dad was trying to come up with a way not only to get revenge, but to scare Mr. Duck enough to force him to give sis back her things. Sis said she was fine with whatever he wanted to do if it got her belongings back, but wanted to make sure none of it could be traced back to her. Nothing happens until about a month later, and Donald Duck calls sis out of the blue, as if nothing had ever happened, and asks, hey, when would you like to come get your things? How about this Saturday? Evidently, he had some change of heart that is unexplained to this day. She said sure. She didn't trust him, so she didn't want to go alone. She was able to get a male friend to go with her. She gets a U-Haul and just picks up her stuff and gets out. That very evening, she tried several times to call Dad to let him know that she got her things back and all was well, no need for any drastic measures. But it was too late. The wheels had been set in motion. He never answers the phone. Remember, this is pre-cell phone days. So when you're not at home, you don't answer. Sis calls mom, who was living separately from dad for a time. It's complicated. Telling her she can't reach dad. Mom says dad is sick, and that's probably why he's not answering his phone. At 11:30 p.m., sis gets a call from Donald's girlfriend who asks her, what are you doing? Sis replies, I'm at home in bed. Why? She responds, someone just blew up Donald's car. Sis's heart drops. She obviously knows who did it. The police ask Donald Duck who would want to do this to him, and he answers Sis's name. So she becomes suspect number one. Sis asks girlfriend if Donald is scared. Girlfriend says yes, they are spending the night in a hotel. Fortunately, the call from girlfriend to Sis just a few minutes after the explosion gave Sis her alibi. Sis lived over 30 minutes away and could not have answered her home phone if she had been the one to ignite the bomb. The bomb did its job well. It turned the Porsche into an unrecognizable wreck, took out the adjacent car. The Porsche was parked at the end of the carport, so there was only one car parked next to it, and destroyed many feet of the carport above both cars. I'm guessing the tank in the Porsche was near full. Just after Sis gets off the phone, she calls mom, telling her that someone blew up Mr. Duck's car, and she thinks it was dad. While she is on the phone with mom, another call comes in. Call waiting. A fancy feature in the days of landlines. It's dad. He says mysteriously, there is a box outside your door. Bring it in. You never talked to me tonight. Sis is a little afraid to open the box, but it turns out to be just some of her son's items that he had left with his grandpa. Clothes and toys. Months later at Christmas, Sis asked dad about it, and he confessed. Turns out he really was very sick, physically, when he pulled that stunt. Sis was touched. that he would go to so much effort and risk jail time for her, all while being ill. She asked him if he was scared driving back. He said yes, and that every headlight behind him he took to be a cop until he reached the state line. Sis found out from girlfriend that the cops said the job was very amateur, certainly not the work of professional. But hey, it did the job. Dad told Sis he had asked a co-worker, who was once a member of the aforementioned Crips, about how to make a car bomb, and she instructed him. I truly regret not discussing it with him personally, but we weren't close since I left home. If you didn't need him, he had a hard time having a relationship with you. Plus, I was married to a woman for many years who kept me from my parents and siblings, so I don't have better details. Thank God that 25-year marriage is over, and my current wife loves my family. Sorry, but the story is true. One hilarious detail. Donald Duck continued to father offspring and date very young women. His current wife is my age exactly, and he has a daughter many years younger than my youngest child. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with one of these half-sisters. A marvelous person despite half her DNA. Her mother was never married to Donald, and this sister is the age of my youngest daughter. I told her the story of the exploded Porsche. She found it very amusing, because she says, Donald loves to tell a story about how he was prosecuting some mob bosses, and a couple of thugs came to his door trying to threaten him. Of course, being the big bad brave man he is, he did not back down. And what was his reward? Those thugs blew up his car. I think it's hilarious that he tells this story to his children, but now they know the truth. He is the biggest BSer I have ever met. Also, due to Donald's allegation that it was my sister who blew up his car. What? Not mobsters, but a 22-year-old girl. The condo association, or whatever, tried to sue my sister for the damage to the carport. It came to naught. They were grasping at straws, because there was no evidence of course. But it did scare her, and cause some anxiety. Thanks for listening.